Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. Where we occasionally take side quests because, frankly, that's how conversations work. We are on our second episode, and we got some great feedback from the audience, and so we've been implementing some of those things, and we're going to do this first one now where we dive into what we read and a brief synopsis of the plot before we go straight into discussing our thoughts on it. So, Slava, take it away.
Yes. So we read Umney's Last Case, which is a short story by Stephen King. It's actually a favorite of the author from the collection that it's found in, which is Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Umney's Last Case is a Raymond Chandler pastiche. For those of you who don't know who Raymond Chandler is, he is a writer from the 30s that wrote hardboiled detective novels. So this story follows a private investigator named Clyde Umney on the last day in what he knows as the real world. While it begins as any other ordinary day in 1930s Los Angeles, Umney soon learns it is anything but that, and that his new client is a crime fiction writer in the real world who created him and now wants to switch places with him to escape his world and the trauma of losing his wife and child. As soon as Umney wakes up, he discovers that his life as he knows it is falling apart. All his lifelong friends and associates are abruptly departing in one fashion or another for reasons ranging from winning the lottery to getting terminal cancer. And many of them, to his surprise, express disdain towards Umney in place of farewells. To add to Umney's vexation, his favorite diner closes, his secretary quits, and his landlord repaints the dingy office building with bright, cheerful colors. While he is brooding in his office, the uninvited client, named Samuel D. Landry, comes in and sits in Umney's office. In their brief but world-altering conversation, it is revealed that after Landry suffered the loss of his wife and child and a severe case of shingles, Landry decided to immerse himself in the world of his creation. Landry demonstrates his power in and over Umney's world by stopping time, altering space and matter, and then he explains to a helpless Umney that he intends to take his place. An unknown power, assumingly the same power that brought the author into this world, forces Umney to take on the writer's identity in 1994. Quickly, he finds himself in Sandry's house, living Sandry's life. As he adjusts to his new existence, he finds this real world dull and inadequate compared to his life in his world, which he admits was ultimately a creation of the writer's mind and not actually real. Umney decides to figure out how to return to his own world and take revenge on his creator. So that, Jonathan, is Umney's Last Case in 35 seconds.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think in today's world, short stories are less appreciated than they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of why we wanted to start here with short stories. It's easier for us to dive into, but it's also a look backward to say, what are the short stories of the past that really stood out? And King, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more about him than I do, but he got his start with the book Carrie, right?
Correct.
Okay. So that was the 80s?
74.
74. Time was different back then, and I'm not that old. I lived through the 90s. I was born in the 80s, but I lived through the 90s. But yeah, there was something about this writing that felt veteran to me, which I liked. And so when you mentioned it to me that it was this old Raymond Chandler pastiche, I frankly didn't know anything about that. But even though I didn't know anything about it, I could feel that this writing was veteran and weathered and established in a really good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's in his notes on the collection. Like I said, this is a collection of short stories from Nightmares and Dreamscapes. And at the end of each book, he usually has like an epilogue or a notes section where he kind of describes the process of, writing the short stories. And for Umney's Last Case, he said that, first of all, Raymond Chandler was someone that got him through, a time in his life when he was a lonely kid. He was reading and just devouring this. So this pastiche is kind of, I guess, as pastiches are, an homage to Raymond Chandler. But he never had the need for this sort of a voice until he wanted to ask the question, what relationship do I have to the worlds and the characters I create? And this story came out of it. And he also says in other notes or lectures that I've heard that short story is more difficult than a long novel, because you can fudge a little bit in a long novel, and continuity errors might get missed by a reader in a long novel. But you have to hone in whatever you're trying to say in a short story. You have to be so tight with your language so you can end it well. You can keep the reader from beginning to end reading it, that the ending is satisfying, whatever that ending might be. And this was a pretty good. I like the ending of this one too.
Yes, the ending. So right at the beginning, there's just I do want to talk about pastiches. Pastiches are an interesting thing, and I want to get back to those. But first, as I was reading the story, when this uninvited customer and client comes in to talk to Umney, I started, and it's based partly on the assumption of nightmares and dreamscapes. I haven't read as much Stephen King as you have, but I'm like, this guy's the devil. This is a devil or a god. Like, preferably it was the devil, because this person comes in and is unfazed by the main character. He's almost got he's given, and I think it was this line, he's like, he had a scent on him that I'd never smelled before, but I knew it. And it's like, oh, well, that's, to me, it was like nightmares and dreamscapes. All right, it's probably the devil. Turns out it's not. But it was my first thought when this being comes in, before it even keeps going, because, as we read stories, we make assumptions. That's part of the beauty of reading a story. The writer writes something in a way to purposefully draw your attention to moments or details, and then, big reveals later. But I don't know if you can hark back to the first time that you read this piece, but like, what was your understanding of who this being was that walked in? And then I want to go back to pastiches.
Yeah. Well, when I first read this, I read it when it came out, and I think it came out in 92 or 93. So when I read this, I was 12 years old.
Wow.
Yes, 12 years old. So I devoured Stephen King when I was a kid. Now, when I say devoured, I mean short stories. I read probably a good portion of The Stand, Needful Things, that's really it for his novels. But I devoured his short stories. I think he has 4 or 5 collections, maybe a little bit more now. So I would read and reread those. I can't tell you what I thought as a 12-year-old about Umney's last case. Fair. But when I reread it this time, and when I reread it again about 2 years ago, what I enjoyed about it is exactly what King meant me to enjoy about it. And I only read those notes this time around. So that's an interesting, tidbit for what was going on in my brain. So asking the question, what relationship does the author have with his characters? Why does a character do the things he or she does? And, it's probably a conversation for a whole episode in itself.
It is,
that's what came to me the second time I read it. Both times, that was kind of in the back of my head. I'm like, it's interesting. What of himself does the author put into this character?
So on that note, you and I had a community friend back in the day, and I maybe you remember him saying this. Hamlet doesn't know that Shakespeare exists unless Shakespeare writes Hamlet meets a man named Shakespeare, right? And it's this, I think that there's honestly metaphysical implications here about that. That's not what the podcast is about, so we're not going to get into it. But I've always thought about that, where it's like the character doesn't know the author unless the author reveals himself, right?
Absolutely. So
I thoroughly enjoyed this short story. So it was a good pick on your account. And another thing, and then I really will go back to pastiches, folks. Is I love old lingo. I love linguistics, not in a deeply nerd kind of way, because I don't have that. I don't want to say level of comprehension, but I don't have. It's just not that. That's not why I love it. I love it because it's fascinating to me, and I find communication fascinating. And so, like, the first few pages, or like very early on in the story, he goes, "Yeah, I gave her the old slap and tickle," and I was like, I've never heard it called that before.
Yeah. Yeah. So
And
you could
then-
say you've loved the lingo of the 1930s since Hector was a pup.
Yeah, since Hector was a pup. Yeah, just all these like
Like this-
one-liners.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that's a weird way. But you know exactly what it means.
Yeah.
It's just an old phrase. He didn't have to tell me that the old slap and tickle was sex. I knew that from calling it the old slap and tickle. I don't know
Yeah.
how I knew that. And it's just something about the way that language has developed over time is just absolutely riveting to me, because it's almost a snapshot of a moment in time of how those people communicated. Now, this isn't I want to just clarify, this isn't a moral judgment on what was being talked about, but rather a comment on linguistics and common vernacular for the 1930s.
Yeah. That's what made the story so enjoyable. And as King sometimes does, he mixes like humorous things with serious, conversation. So in between, like these little vignettes of the day where Umney's life is falling apart and he knows something terrible is happening. He just has this gut feel before he meets Landry. Umney knows something's going on and it's not good. But in between those things, like you have these little internal dialogues that the character's having that are very humorous. Just the way he interacts with people. It's funny. It has like this,
Yeah.
help me with a word. Like there's a word for this that I'm trying to describe.
Well, it's not macabre. I can't even pronounce it. I
Macabre.
really like the word macabre. It's a French word, I'm pretty sure. Macabre. I should just slaughter to all of our French listeners, because
Apologies.
we're big in French. Un, deux, trois, slaughtering your language with my barbaric tongue. What were you trying to say?
Well, the humor, there's like the seesaw in this story where there's these humorous things, and I couldn't think exactly how
Juxtaposition?
This juxtaposition of humor and dark things. Like the character's world is coming undone.
Oh yeah, juxtaposition. That's
Yeah.
what I would use.
Yeah.
Also, we're gonna get to know each other as the podcast goes on. Not you and me, but like us in the audience. Sometimes I have to talk just to figure out how to put what I've been thinking into words. And usually that takes the form of humor. And then I have to backtrack and go, what was I talking about? So that's a little fun little tidbit for you there.
That's why these podcasts are 3 hours long.
Oh my, no. I've got friends who listen to them that are super long like that. Now, granted, I guess I don't have anything to say because I'll go through a thick double C's book in audiobook form that's 50 hours. So I guess I don't have a whole lot to say to someone who sits and listens to a 3-hour podcast when I'm willing to trounce through a 200-hour epic tomes of 4 different books and still waiting for book 5. Stormlight Archives. Anyway, Brandon Sanderson. Remember, I'm not the biggest fan. I'm just a fanboy because,
I made sure in the description notes to put down that you're the second biggest fan of Sanderson. Clearly established that in the first.
As another side quest here. In the last episode, I said King of Endor when I was referring to Tolkien, and I also tied myself with being a big Tolkien fan. And then when I was going through and we were editing it, I realized how much of an idiot I am because it's the Witch King of Angmar and not the King of Endor. And so all of you real fans out there, Mazel tov to you. No one had to tell me this. I caught it beforehand, but then one of my buddies was like, "You're a big fan, huh? What are you talking about? Because that's not real." I went, "I know. Thank you for the feedback.
Yeah.
I did ask you for feedback."
Well,
So
at least you didn't say when Mr. and Mrs. Beaver meet Lucy on the way to Mordor.
I'm a big Star Wars fan. I love
Captain
when
Kirk.
Aslan comes in to talk to Captain Jean-Luc Picard about the latest Quidditch tournament.
My favorite chapter.
I'm
And Patrick Ruffus's trilogy on Star Wars.
yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of things that I could say about that, and it's pretty funny. I'm just going to stop myself because sometimes I use self-control. Pastiches. I want to get back to pastiches because it's an interesting. I didn't know that this is what it was called because you know what a parody is. It's kind of making fun of a word and mocking it. But a pastiche is an homage where you're imitating rather than mocking, and I think that this is an interesting line to walk honestly, because for one person, it might be, oh, he's making fun of it. And to another person, they go, no, we know the author. We've read a bunch of his work. He really enjoys it. Do you have thoughts on how someone could write a pastiche instead of a parody? And like, when have you crossed from pastiche to parody? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. I think when
Yeah, it's tough, right? So, to give you a parody example, Spaceballs was a parody of Star Wars, right?
Mhm.
Where they're literally just making fun of this thing because it's over the top, it's campy, it's just very blatant in its we're Star Wars, but we're not Star Wars. You just know because you go way over the top.
Well, in the
Very
name
exaggerated.
Spaceballs.
What? Yeah.
Spaceballs.
Yeah,
Come on.
yeah,
Not
all of it,
Star
all of
Wars.
it,
Yeah.
all of it. So that's, I think, if you purposefully go over the top. But I think that doing pastiches is a very nuanced thing. Well, frankly, people don't do it anymore because we don't have the attention span for it. And trying to write in the voice of someone else is difficult.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head. I'm glad. Yeah, this is cool. Because I think the over-the-top campy stuff, that's where it can turn into parody. And then there's two kind of parodies. Parodies is to outright mock, or a parody just to kind of maybe gently poke fun at something that you admire.
Elbow the guy next to you through the fourth wall.
Yeah. So another book we're going to be doing for our first 5 episodes is, short story, Neil Gaiman's The Study in Emerald, which is a pastiche of a Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet. So, and there you have some over-the-top things, right? But that was on purpose. Like, and we'll talk about it when that episode comes along.
Yeah.
But so sometimes it can be just a tiny bit over the top because you're playing around in that world. And if it's a little bit over the top, it doesn't necessarily have to be mocking. Just like in Neil Gaiman's pastiche of Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet. But sometimes that over the top is just because you're playing around with it. That's your story. You're doing an homage, but you want to do it your way.
The original fan fiction.
The original fan fiction. Very nuanced. Right, exactly. So it's nuanced. And I think people who read, they'll be able to tell. So when I watch Spaceballs, I don't think that the Mel Brooks hates Lucas, like they have some kind of feud or something.
Right. So I want to stay on this pastiche thing just a little bit longer. I pulled up the Wikipedia and it talks about intertextuality. And it says allusion's not pastiche. Literally, allusion may refer to another work, but it does not reiterate it. But both allusion and pastiche are mechanisms of intertextuality. And intertextuality is when a text's meaning is shaped by another text. So this makes me think of old Greek culture where they would go out and they'd have these discourses, and then next week somebody would have an additional discourse, but sometimes it was a cultural slight at the people who had the first discourse, right? And the same thing developed later, and it made me think, well, this pastiche story tool is kind of just you add to the zeitgeist and you hark back to somebody else's writing, you hark back to someone else's style, and you add to the conversation that is this cultural thing. But I think you made a good point there where it requires someone to have a breadth and width of knowledge in literature of, well, at least that specific style, but at minimum to know, oh, hey, this is kind of a look back at so-and-so, you know?
Yeah. Very interesting point, because specifically because of the Greek connection. In my research about pastiches, because I was like, okay, let me dive in a little bit more, because I know what a pastiche is, but there's always more to learn. So what I found in my research specifically of this short story is it also is an example of metalepsis. And what metalepsis is, it's a Greek word. It means it's a figure of speech in which a word or phrase from figurative speech is used in a new context. For example, I've got to catch the worm tomorrow. Well, what does that mean? Well, the early bird catches the worm is a kind of familiar maxim to us, right? So this new thing, this metalepsis, I've got to catch the worm tomorrow, is referring to that maxim, and the subject is compared to the bird. Tomorrow, the speaker will awake early to achieve whatever he wants to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see these things in Umney's last case where he uses some old lingo, but also in different ways. Like, since Hector was a pup.
Who's Hector?
Well, who's Hector? But obviously it's been a long time because you're assuming Hector's as old as, at least 10.
Is
Is old.
older. Yeah.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
Hector actually a dog, or is
Yeah.
Hector a child? Well,
Yeah.
was a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what do you say?
Metalepsis.
Metalepsis.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I would enjoy doing an experiment where you take a bunch of maxims and then you write the follow-up maxim to be the metalepsis of that.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta catch the worm tomorrow. That's the type of stuff where, similar to what you said, go back to the slap and tickle. It's like, you know what it means. Since Hector was a pup, you know what it means. Time has passed and it's been a while. A couple of years ago, I think is another one that he references here.
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts?
My final thoughts are I enjoyed the serious and lighthearted seesaw of the story. I think King routinely combines comical and serious aspects, and he does it effectively. In the books I read and the short stories I read, he does it effectively. But here, it's very effective because, again, Umney, his world is falling apart. And yet, in the middle of everything, even how he reacts to some of this stuff, there's these funny lines. It's just, it's hard to explain unless you read it. So I like that about it. I was interested in the questions that King intended to bring up, like what relationship does the author have with his creations? And again, the pastiche element of it made me want to read Raymond Chandler, at least one book, just to kind of get the feel for it.
I think that that's super fair. And this is one of the things I like about literature is, and well, let me start with this. I think one of the worst things that's ever happened in the state of the world from beginning of creation till now is the burning of the Library of Alexandria. We lost a bunch of knowledge that existed from the ancient world in that fire. And the reason it's bad is, like, there were things that I want to call it secret knowledge, but that's just kind of colloquial. There was knowledge that was in there that was wrong, but it taught you how that culture thought, which is important. It doesn't matter if they were truthful or objective or scientifically correct. It taught you how they thought, and that gives you an insight into who they are anthropologically, what that culture was, or who, whatever. So this is why it was one of the worst things to ever happen. That said, literature of all types, going back as far as you go, whether it's Shakespeare or ancient Mesopotamian tablets with, and this is a good one, I don't know if you've ever read it, is The Richest Man in Babylon, which is a narrative story about how to create wealth. It's fantastic. And it was written on these Mesopotamian tablets, and maybe we'll read it, but I mean, that's got to be a finance episode because it literally is a story about how to make money.
Okay.
It's fascinating. But they, and as I dove into it and after I read it, I looked into where, who came up with this. It's like, no one came up with this. This is from ancient Mesopotamian tablets that they excavated from the earth. It's like, oh, so people back in the day were just real smart and knew how to cultivate wealth. Interesting.
Yeah. That's interesting. 2 quick points. Book burning is always a crime. It's a horrible thing. Even if you object to what you find in that book.
Yeah.
Stop. No.
Eat the fish, spit out the bones. That's what we learned in martial arts years ago. Right. And I've always stuck to that. It's like, you can read something that you completely disagree with, and you probably should, and at least you can take the knowledge and either rebuild your argument or go, okay, this is interesting, and then you put it on the shelf. But by declaring needing to burn the book and whatever, like, you're drawing more attention to it. Yeah. It's why some political figures are of the belief that negative attention is better than no attention. And frankly, that's kind of true. So if you just stop talking about them, no one else will talk about them either, right? You take the power away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to your point a little earlier, you get to learn how the other side thinks. Mm-hmm. And then to your point just seconds ago, you can build a better case if you want to argue against it. But if you can't represent your enemy's position in such a way where he said, or your opponent's position in such a way where he or she says, yeah, I believe that, and then you argue against that, mm-hmm. We can't do that if you don't interact with them.
Right. Your arguments are weaker. Yeah. I would love, and we'd have to plan this out a little more, but I'd love to go through a wisdom literature section because you're making me think about Sun Tzu. And man, there's a lot of stuff that you can pull from Sun Tzu, but it's not really a narrative to be discussed or story or world because he was a general. He's one of the world's greatest generals. Genghis Khan, too. There's just kind of like a bunch of history books, I guess I'd call them, or slices from history that I think would be interesting to discuss. We'll have to talk about that, but let's wrap it up.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Well, what are your 3 thoughts or three things of the conclusions?
You already did it? I already did it. So not necessarily 3 thoughts, but just, the burning of Alexandria, books, the power of books, going back and checking people's culture.
Yeah, well, specifically with Umney's last case, what are your final thoughts on that?
I had them when you were talking earlier. Let me think a second. I enjoyed it. I think I would like to read a little more King. I think that more people should do what King did as an experiment. And filmmakers have done this more today because we have the technology. But when you do make a pastiche or an homage, back to some other person who inspired you that you really enjoyed, I think that that's a sign of honor. I think it's a respect thing. And I think it's drawing people's attention because, look, you and I didn't really know who Raymond Chandler Raymond Chandler was without this short story.
Yep.
And there's dozens, hundreds even probably, of authors who are really good and worth reading that people just won't read because they don't know about them. And so if today's authors will give a pastiche or an homage, even a parody, honestly, like something, people go, oh, that's interesting. Where'd this come from? And then some of them will go and look at this original piece, and you'll re-stir up a love for an older style of writing or storytelling that is currently sitting in the library that is time, gathering dust. So that is the biggest piece that I took away from this. It was entertaining. It was fun. It was enjoyable. But that's it for us.
Yep. Don't burn books, and people born before you are not as dumb as you think.
That's true. Thanks for tuning in today, guys. Check back next week for the next episode where we're going to go through Neil Gaiman's. All right.
Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald.
Thank you. Yep. Those are words, and that's how you say them. Anyway, have a great time wherever you're listening to this.